So with all the good publicity of late in the Star Wars universe, thanks to the increasing impact that The Mandalorian is making to reinvigorate the Star Wars franchise back to its former glory, Jedi Fallen Order was one that already did that a couple of years ago, well, 2019. One of my favourite games of the year, and obviously I covered that in more detail, but now it's had a patch, a next generation patch on both the Series X, the PS5, and obviously that Series S. But what does it actually offer? Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag, and like I've already covered before in my previous videos, this isn't a patch, this isn't a update to the game code, it isn't a genuine next generation version. And despite what many people might be saying, it's not. This is exactly what I covered in my development videos before the consoles even launch, where I said that developers can go back and make updates to the game code itself, the engine, to take advantage of that additional hardware it has underneath, basically changing the options in the menu to say I want to run a high resolution, I want to unlock the frame rate, and potentially turn on features that are built into the engine already. It's a very light touch development, and as such expectations need to be kept in check. It's free, it patches those versions, but what does it actually deliver? Well, the first thing is, this really highlights what I've also covered, and I've covered in my previous videos, about the difference between backwards compatibility on the Xbox consoles and on the PlayStation console. TLDR, the Xbox and the Series S consoles basically do it differently like a PC, and this is intrinsic to their API, their construction, and the SDK. As you can see, this game is still an XDK. Bearing in mind, new Xbox console use the GDK development, so there's not changed anything on those levels. But because it also supports XDK, they can go to that engine, make changes, and re-release it. So now what we get is a version that's actually reduced on the PS5 and enhanced slightly more on the Series X. Now that sounds like a terrible comment, but it's not really as bad as you might think. Although I'm not happy with the overall situation in terms of they probably shouldn't have done it the way they've done, but I can understand why, or at least my assumption as to why they've done it this way. So what have they really done? What have they added and what's changed? Well, the Series X now has the same options it had before. It still has the quality mode and the performance mode. That's exactly the same as what the PS4 Pro used to have as well, and as I covered back in depth. But the performance mode was never really that good, as I already covered. It's a bit poor, it's a bit laggy, it drops into the 30s far too often, and it never feels smooth enough to really be at a 60 FPS title at any real point outside of the introduction, which is quite light and therefore gives an easier run on the engine and the GPU over other parts. But the new version on the Series X solves all that by having all this additional power, which means you can now get a 1080p image running at 60 FPS. The team know this and they've bumped that up. So now it runs at a dynamic resolution between 1080p and 1440p. That's been added in the patch notes, which are very detailed. Now, doing some pixel counts, it hovers around 2240 by 1260 quite often, but it can hit 1440p at some of the lighter moments, specifically the intro sequence, but in heavier sections, certainly on Kashak, it can go down to 1080p. But the temporal AA reconstruction method that Unreal Engine has solves a lot of that and reconstructs the image back to 1440p. Again, these are all these things I covered back in my original analysis of the title last year. That means you get a much sharper and cleaner image, and you get much faster and more consistent frame rates. The game now isn't CPU bound when it was CPU bound, but the game is no longer GPU bound 99% of the time, which it used to be. A lot of people that analysed the game back then said it was. It generally was a GPU bound title, as I covered. So you now get a very consistent and much faster 60 FPS. But as you can see here on the Series X footage, it doesn't hold 60 FPS and it still judders and stutters. And anyone that watched my in-depth optimization analysis of the title back then, I covered this in detail. There's a lot of talk about how the fact that hard drives affect it, and people were talking about it. And I spent a long time in that video just discussing with you how hard drives, how memalloc works, and how memory allocation works in terms of streaming and I/O. And I did say that this has nothing to do with the hard drive. In fact, this is what I said.
Coming up is the most impactful moments of the title, and that is streaming, or is widely referred to just I/O, and that doesn't really mean that much. This isn't to do with your hard drive. This isn't specifically a hard drive issue at all. Changing your hard drive, upgrading it, will make no difference to these moments. The PS4 and the Xbox One S here that I'm running both have SSDs on them. The PS4 is an internal SSD, and the Xbox One S is an external SSD, and it's even quicker running here on the external SSD than it is on the internal on the Xbox One S. If that was the issue, The rotational and seek time of a standard 54,000 or 72,000 RPM hard drive that you get in these consoles as standard, including the premium ones, would have a huge impact. You're talking average of 4 or 5 milliseconds just to seek to the data you want to read and then read the data yourself.
So as you can see, I stated back then that fixing this with the fastest SSD would make no difference. And here we are with the fastest SSD in the PS5 and a very, very fast one on the Series X. And it still does it. It still judders, it still stutters, it still has problems with streaming. It's got nothing to do with the SSD, as I covered, and that's been proven true by this newer hardware. And bearing in mind, the Series X and the Series S use the hardware better, which I'll cover in a moment. No, in actual fact, nothing to do with the SSD. It's all about mem-alloc and the CPU cost of generating code, the GPU cost and the bandwidth. All those combined cause the issues. It's improved here, yes, because of much, much faster hardware, but that's not the SSD. It's improved because the CPU's better, the RAM's better, the overall subsystem of the whole console is better. Therefore, you get improvements, but you don't fix it. If the game was rewritten to take advantage of the hardware better, then you wouldn't have these issues, the SSD, the I/O streaming, all that would be fixed, and the allocation would be much better. So this game, again, was all about the optimization stage, which I don't think it got enough care and attention, but I covered that back then. As you can see, it judders, it stutters, and it skips frames. And it does that on all versions. Does it on the S, does it on the PS5, there's no difference here at all. So you can still get drops down into the low 40s at points. They're very brief, but they do happen. So bear that in mind when we're talking about performance. If we cast that aside though, performance across the consoles is very good. Certainly the PS5 and the Series X now really hold 60 FPS pretty much all the time in combat. There's a few dips here and there, there's a few GPU dips. And some of that comes around the fact that the Xbox Series X has the dynamic resolution, the PS5 doesn't. So the PS5 now has removed the performance quality mode menu, it's gone, it's no longer in the S as well. And now you're fixed at 60 FPS at the highest point it ran in the old resolution mode. So they've turned DRS off, so dynamic scaling is turned off, and thus it now runs at 2133 by 1200 all the time. And whereas the Xbox Series X runs dynamically up that 1080p and 1440p, and that's generally because when you patch a game you've got to QC and check it and validate it, so it's much easier. And obviously in the development process there's no options to do that on the PS4 like there is the Series X, so therefore they've just taken the quickest option, which is just let's put it to the maximum and let it run, and that makes sense. So unfortunately this is not some conspiracy, they've just done it because it's the easiest, simplest method to get, and you now get the sharpest image quality you did in resolution mode, but you get the performance much better than you did in performance mode. So it's the best of the both. I don't see why you'd pick any other option because you're not really losing out. But obviously you are losing out to the Xbox players who get the option of playing it at 30 FPS mode with a dynamic solution up to 4K, down to 512p. So yeah, great benefit, looks good, it is much sharper, but again I'd recommend you play it in the performance mode. And then the Series S is basically PS4 Pro mode. It goes down to 1080p as a maximum. It's locked at 60 FPS, or at least it's unlocked frame rate. Again, there's no options in the menu. It's completely removed once you patch it, same as it is on PS5. And then you're left with a game that scales between 720p and 1080p. It upsamples back to 1080p, but it's never at 1080p. It's generally somewhere around 1440 by 810. But it can go down to 720p again on Cash Hack on the heavier sections, and like you've seen, the performance level then can also dip as well. So it's not a great performing game on the Series S, but by a long chalk. It's never 60, and it doesn't feel that much different. A little better, don't forget, it's a little better than the Xbox One X and the PS4 Pro, but not by a great deal. So if you can play this, it's certainly the best place to play it, unless of course if you've got a PS5 and a Series X, and then you get pretty much a sharp, cleaner, smoother running title with those little glitches and stutters aside. And again, just to show you the fact that they can utilise the hardware better because they've got those API calls, because they've got the options in the SDK, you can see the test here against loading. Guess which one's slowest? It's the PS5. And that's because, again, it's a backwards compatibility mode based on hardware emulation. It's nothing more than the PS4 Pro, as fast as it can possibly be. So it's probably using all of the speed and the cores of the GPU and the CPU, but that doesn't mean it's using all of the hardware. It just means it's gotten the improvement of that clock rate. But it's very, very limited because it's hardware emulation. But as you can see, it's twice as fast, 16 seconds to load on average between the two, and the PS4 is up to the 40 seconds. So yeah, like I say, it's not a great patch in terms of what it's done with the PS5, but it does at least improve all versions, you know, some better than others, but the Series X has the most options and it's the only one that keeps that quality and performance mode. And this is what I said back when I covered it. This is the benefit of Xbox format. It's not got as many next generation titles. Hate me, but that's true. That's just the way it is. But it's designed around using your existing titles better and making it easy for teams to port and flip-flop between developing on all versions. So again, it's those wins and losses, it's that balance, it's that compromise of choice. The PS5 is got more options for next generation titles, but it limits what it can do outside of the hardware emulation to make it less of an overhead for developers, whereas the Series X and the Series S has the options of playing older titles much better, but also making it easier for games to go back and update the existing XDK and add a little more and squeeze a little more out of the hardware. And here you're seeing pretty much an identical game, but you've got the choice of the 4K option and it's faster loading on the Xbox Series X and the Series S. Still a great game, still love it. Obviously pulling from such a rich source material, the art, the animation, the materials, the character models, overall the detail in the world and the lore that it brings from the Jedi, the Force, the Empire, it's all exceptional. It really sucks you in with a great story. And generally that mixture of Jedi skills and Force skills, that really is one of the best I've seen in a long time. And it's a combination of Dark Souls meets Jedi obviously, but it's also a God of War. They've definitely got that Stig's touch in terms of God of War 3 with the scale and the camera pans and the movement in and out and gameplay when you're playing, and it really mixes up that evolution of traversal, massive battles, great combat, and you know, an exceptional scale in terms of building up your skill set. And there's some real superb moments throughout the entire story. And the backtrack on some of the planets can be a bit frustrating, but overall I really enjoyed it and I heartily recommend it. And it's never been better. So now on the next generation of consoles you get the best version of it that you can play. Yeah, it still has some issues with glitches, some stuttering, and some physics issues generally, but this is true of every single version, including the top-end PC, which also has similar issues across the board. It's a quick and easy utilisation of that, but it's not going to maximise it. They've not changed the engine or anything significant, they've just enhanced the engine options to get more out of it. But it's still one of the most enjoyable and rewarding games of the generation, and certainly one of the best slices of Jedi action we've seen in a long time. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this and that explanation of just what this update actually is and just how powerful any tweaks can be. I'll catch you on the next one.